la vérité touche au réel.
Young Jacquians have assembled. We have a very special guest. We have a special guest with us. Brian Becker, Dr. Todd McGowan himself, the inimitable Russell Spriglia.
Isabel Millar.
Engaging the unconscious. In the imaginary domain, we have an intersubjective dialectic.
Vanishing mediators.
What is up, everybody? The unvarnished meat eaters are back with another dynamic episode of the Vanishing Mediators. Today, for a nice change of pace, we're going to be talking about the theoretician, psychoanalyst, Jacques Lacan. And today's episode is on lecture 21 of seminar 2 of Jacques Lacan, entitled Sosie.
Sosie.
These
Like
love Sosie.
Yep, one of Chief Keef's names, right? Sosie? No, that's Sosa.
Right. This is the one and only, this is the Hapax. It's the one and only mention of Chief Keef in Lacan's entire ouvre. So
right. Lacan was definitely a secret listener of Chief Keef.
They call avant la lettre before Chief Keef. So this lecture concerns a play by Plautus, which was rewritten by Molière, the French playwright. It's called Amphitryon. And I think it's based on an ancient Greek myth. Essentially, what we have here is a man who's a general, one of these alpha males you hear about. He goes off to battle or somewhere, maybe vacation. And while he's away, the god Jupiter disguises himself as Amphitryon, as gods Roman and Greek are known to do, disguise themselves as different animals and other figures. They're very unscrupulous characters, so that he can essentially cuck the real Amphitryon. But Amphitryon isn't the star of the show here. It's Amphitryon's slave, Sosia, whose identity is also stolen and recreated by the father of Jupiter, Mercury, who wants to buy his son some time while Amphitryon is on his way back to meet his wife. So basically what happens is, well, Amphitryon eventually meets with the real Sosie, but not before the fake Sosie meets up with his doppelganger, his double, who is Mercury, the god, and the exchange between them is quite silly and illustrates many of the key components of Lacan's definition of the ego as he's laid it out up until this point. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. What is of concern here is the ego, as he mentions.
Right.
Entire seminar is about the ego. And it's basically, we're going to take off from a very strange starting point. And what did you want to say, Andrew?
It's like pretty much like what we get is like a dynamic of how the master-slave dialectic plays out within the ego and the other, in this, and why it's important to realize that and not take the ego as a given, from which we stated from our last episode on critiquing Fairbairn, right? But the trajectory is odd, because he starts off with saying that what was it? why is it the case? So pretty much I asked the question, but like for Lacan, it's like he states something that our wives cheat on us with God from time to time. So like, why does Lacan want to start with that? You know, and from there we start to get back into some Levi-Strauss and talking about symbolic pacts, marriages and alliances, and he even goes so far as to invoke Proudhon, the French anarchist, and talking about the nature concerning fidelity in marriages, in kind of, I'm not too familiar with a lot of Proudhon's work. Just know that Marx was a reader of Proudhon and also critical of him a lot of times. But I guess for Lacan, Proudhon gets something right with understanding, symbolic pacts and fidelity, even like within marriage, which sometimes seems, I think he even mentions that like it could be seen that like Proudhon is trying to mystify fidelity, but like no, there's something at play which is not on like a level of like transcendental or mystification, something on like how Lacan will kind of see how language or the symbolic order functions. And so I think that's why he wants to kind of double down on the Levi-Straussian anthropology. I don't know what you would think about that.
I mean, he grafts the first two sections of this lecture together very artfully, if you think about it, because when he says our wives cheat on us with God from time to time, he is alluding to what I just explained in my synopsis of Amphitryon, the Mercury disguising himself as Amphitryon. So it should be mentioned that Amphitryon's wife doesn't know that this is Mercury that she's having sex with, but that because he looks exactly like Amphitryon. But there are a lot of different threads going on here. I read this lecture 3 times, and there are many levels that you could read this on, because to take it back to Proudhon, what can we say about that? Well, one, it's a very odd sort of citation, because when I think Proudhon, most people were thinking of him as as being in dialogue with Marx, essentially. And I don't know Proudhon all that well, and maybe scholars of Proudhon would disagree with me, but it seems like he's not associated with questions of love, romance, marriage, fidelity, the meaning of marriage. So it's an interesting citation in that regard. But yeah, here he's talking about how there is, and you mentioned Levi Strauss, we often refer to this concept of his, an expression he coined, which is symbolic efficiency or efficacity, I think is one of the other ways it's described. But basically that what the symbolic operates all on its own, and within marriage it depends ultimately on a kind of pact. Now this pact, which may have been more so front and center, much more pronounced in ancient times. He refers to Roman marriage, concubinage, as an alternative to Roman marriage, which had very little to do with love, but definitely had everything to do with holding society together, being the underpinnings of society. Whereas now, because as he says, we live in an era of the humanization, I like how he puts this, I think, the humanization of the ego, marriage is considered an institution that is essentially founded upon, to quote the title of everyone's favorite VH1 show, The Rock of Love.
A
rock of love. Marriage is about love. You know, there's that Frank Sinatra song, Love and Marriage. Everyone, they go together like horse and carriage. That's what marriage is about. That wouldn't have made sense, at least. And I know people will say, well, this is kind of like a Western perspective. I bet, though, Levi Strauss, I would wager to say, if he was going to draw from his innumerable examples, and literally like innumerable examples of different cultures throughout history, I bet love figures into it very little. So this is one of this pact has to do with an elementary structure. Now, another thing I'll just put out there as a footnote, and maybe we can pick this up later near the end. I just want to dog ear this. He also talks about this idea of marriage being directed towards the wife's love in this pact is directed toward all men.
Exactly. Right? I wanted to bring that up.
And later at the end of this lecture, he's going to talk about, I think for the first time, the phallus.
Right.
I could have mentioned it before, but actually we're going to talk about the phallus, and it's connected here. So there are a lot of parts in this chapter that connect up, but at different points. So when you reread it, you realize how it interlocks at different points.
Exactly. And you know what's interesting too, like thinking about it, I just want to evoke something that was talked about in like which chapter it was, I forgot, in For They Know Not What They Do, but it's like, you know, the difference between man and men. And so it's like he points out right there in that section that you just quoted of the woman's love in the institution of marriage, or the bonds of marriage, is directed toward all men and not man. Isn't that kind of interesting? So like, you know, we get into this maybe sort of idea of man as the sum of all parts versus like man as like, you know, an identity. Right?
Well, I think though, if you read this footnote here, it says there's a difference between tous and alle, all the men, all the particulars, and all men. I think that if we were going to read it in a very highly technical way, it would bear out what you're saying. But he also says here, it is universal function. It is the universal man, the universal woman.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if we're a little too high on the fumes of For They Know Not What They Do here. And I think he does mean the man.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
I think he does mean like the notion. If this was going, if we're going to take it to Hegel, I think this would be a judgment of the notion, but I'm not entirely sure. You could be right too, but I don't know that he has it entirely worked out. Lacan definitely doesn't have it as worked out as Zizek does.
Right.
But maybe he's conflating the two as well.
Because what would be the difference?
Not at this point.
Yeah. But what would be the difference between man and versus, you know, all men, but what, right? And you mentioned the possibility of introduction to the phallus for the first time. So the universal exception, right, is what is going to make man versus all men.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think that I don't know if what we've been reading with the four judgments would perfectly align with this or not, but you know, this is Lacan prior to really formulating the formulae of situation, wherein the universal emerges almost as a byproduct, right? Once we get to the notion, we're no longer dependent on either a predicate, a specific predicate to define the subject, nor a subject which is invariant in relation to a predicate. We get the kind of universal that he's been talking about throughout this entire seminar, which is decentered and in a very dubious relation with the predicate, which would align the notion with the concept. You know, this is what Mikey was, I was just listening to him talk about this. It's like always under construction, essentially. Yeah. But right here, I don't think he has a perfectly fleshed out idea of the formula of sexuation. I think what he's getting at more so is that the man in this case is the other.
Right.
So it's addressed to the other.
Yeah, and
Marriage.
Brian
Wow.
Becker brings this up in like talking about it, since we're talking about like the ego and the other in this, we get this Kojevian master slave dialectic. We could see marriage also operating it as in like Brian Becker talks about this. He mentions this like saying like I am or you are my master, I am your slave, and switches it around and says you are my master, I am your woman, right? And so we could kind of see that play about within here. What's interesting though is that like as you were kind of reiterating about how we see marriage and the institution operate, in the sense of what Proudhon sees is the institution of like, as you said, the humanization or like the ego. But like for these alliances, these kinships that we see in Levi Strauss, it's like well, he says, Lacan will say that they're androcentric. Is that the term?
And androcentric,
which is pretty much like, you know, oriented around like pretty much male ideas, like, or the man, pretty much patriarchy in a sense. Slightly, you know, but you know, the difference is patriarchy is more about like the paternal function, but you know, they can be one and the same. That women were kind of put in this symbolic status and viewed highly insofar as that they could be exchanged, and the exchange could bring about alliances and kinships for a peace thing. So it's like you see this women being valued insofar as that they can act as the Mausian gift, right? They're not treated like objects, but they are treated as something, because you know the status of women is so far as that they could be a wife, a sister, a daughter, and even a mother. And what is that? But also, you know, allow for the expansion of a clan or a kinship. You know, so I think right here, like we get this distinction between how, you know, women are viewed today through the liberalization, or even during a Proudhon's time, and you know, the fact that there is this and even like with Marx, like the fact that divorce was allowed or was legalized, it like changed the position and status of women in the symbolic structure. But mainly it's like, I think Lacan says, it's like, well, it still doesn't change. Like he says something weird, like, and I could be overly paraphrasing, but like, even though that there's this liberalization and women get to decide who they marry, it doesn't change their symbolic position of the marriage institution itself, if that makes sense. Like, even though that they're allowed to choose who their lover would be, it's like it doesn't change the fact that they're only given a certain possible you know, sets of, they're only given like a set of possibilities within the symbolic order that allows for the possibility of marriage, and it still fits in like this sort of symbolic pact. Maybe we could call it patriarchy or androcentrism, right? And ultimately what I'm trying to get at is that like what Lacan is building up is like there's a sexual tension between man and woman, and we could see it even in the time of Roman marriage for name or some type of status. He's like there's a difference between patrician marriages and patrician class versus the plebes, right? But at the same time we see how like the antagonism of man and woman happen in this marriage, in which a woman poisons her husband, you know, so it's been going on for a long time.
Feminine rebellion is nothing new. In this sense, we've never been dealing with some sort of meek, passive creature who can't think for themselves. It's like that women, of course, are in a misogynist fashion throughout Western history, mostly portrayed as, when they do have a mind, like treacherous, you know, poisonous, if not literally, then intent on poisoning the man. But the idea is that they definitely are seen as having power in a way. It's like they're not, it's not about whether they're respected or not, or whether they're completely objectified, like this total and utter Andrew Tate type of objectification of women is
Yeah.
relatively new phenomenon. It's that within this institution of marriage, they're voluntarily giving themselves over
Mhm.
to, and this is me paraphrasing from seminar 1, but another figure, the man, who acts as a limitation on their freedom, as would the body itself.
Right.
This is what Lacan says, giving themselves over to almost a new limitation beyond just, let's say, the specular image,
Mhm.
which was the original limitation, wherein the body is formed out of parts and then reformed, as you showed me in that quote from the ego ideal. But I'm bouncing all over the place. The point is that the pact of marriage here has a central dynamic wired into it,
Mhm.
which cannot be surpassed through any kind of bourgeois, individualistic, liberal, humanistic notion
Right.
of equality, so long as the institution itself exists. So here, that is the imaginary.
Right. Yeah. And
There's
it's
an
like,
imaginary tension between the symbolic there, which still comes forward. It still juts to the surface,
yeah,
no matter
because like
what.
that's the thing of like what you could see, like, and I hope like this isn't too far of a stretch to get us off topic, but it's like the bourgeois notion of marriage and like the sort of ideology that binds the institution. It's like it conceals the fact that the institution of marriage is nothing but a symbolic pact configured within the symbolic order, right? And we can't see the symbolic order because, or like for what it's kind of propagating, due to the fact that we think that we're these free subjects that you know, to evoke the term practical solipsis, like Zizek would say, it's like because we take ourselves as given and that we kind of set the standard, we are able to be the masters of our own world and think we have free choice, that, you know, oh, we're not affected by the world, like we chose to be in this. But it's like, as I said earlier, the conditions of possibility are already set for you to be able to have this choice to begin with, right? Even though you are able to divorce or, you know, go out on a date and like, oh, I choose to marry this one. Well, it's like, well, because the institutions, the material conditions have already been set for that to take place. They're already mediated for you. And I think that's what's kind of interesting about that. So what I'm trying to say is like, because of, like you said, this imaginary relationship within marriage, it misrecognizes the master involved, the other, because of the identification we have with this bond, with this symbolic pact.
Right, because it's like marriage today would be considered from a more liberal perspective to be a kind of alliance.
Right.
Right.
And the last thing I would say is like, you know, we would look at like, you know, these sort of tribes that Strauss is, and like people like Mauss were studying, and from the sort of liberal sociologist, anthropologist perspective, we'd be like, oh, they're so primitive, like, you know, we've evolved and we have technology, they don't. But it's like, we think that we're doing things, especially like this, out of the graces of our own free will and our free liberty, our own rights. But it's like, we're actually more duped than them, because when they marry, they realize what's at stake, the symbolic order. They're exchanging women for the sake of, you know, creating stronger alliances, right? We just think it's like, oh, you know, we're just trying to live our best life. We're trying to be free. You know, I'm just doing, you know, what I just trying to live, you know, I'm just trying to be happy. I just want love. But they don't realize how the quest for love is already a sort of symbolic exchange or within the system, or we could say capitalism has a lack of symbolic exchange, but that doesn't change the fact that
Right.
we're so mystified by the ideology within the symbolic order that we don't see how we're just propagating exchange of signifiers versus these different tribes that know what's at stake. It's like we have to create this pact.
Yeah, that's not to say that it's not an endorsement of a symbolic order that exacts this kind of exchange. It's what we're saying is that nor is it a naturalization of that symbolic order. It's just the order. Of course, a symbolic order can itself be transformed.
Right.
I think it's like, so long as this institution of marriage exists, there is an exchange happening, or the pact is built on a kind of exchange. But should we move past marriage a little bit and get into? I think we.
Right. Oh, and I just wanted to point out, like in page 262, he does like again reiterate that all men for Proudhon is the universal man. And I really like this last paragraph right here at the end of 262 when he says, in other words, in the primitive form of marriage, if a woman isn't given or doesn't give herself to a god, to something transcendent, the fundamental relation suffers every form of imaginary degradation. And that is what does happen because we aren't, and we haven't been for a long time, cut out to embody gods.
Yeah,
right?
that's, what's interesting about that is it goes to show you that though you would think of Roman society as the zenith of, zenith sounds positive, but like the epitome of a kind of patriarchal formation, the men are castrated by the fact that they aren't gods, and it is insofar as they fall short of being actual gods that society can, in some sense, be allowed to form a whole, because there are these think about the gods as they imagine them, which are these idiotic, horny, capricious creatures who have no morality whatsoever. They're not bound by any morality because they're mortal. It's like, it seems like for the Romans, in this case, it's like mortality. It goes hand in hand with morality.
Yeah.
In some sense, where it's like, if you're immortal, all powerful, then fuck it, right? It's like, these are the gods that they have to worry about screwing them over, cucking them. So really, it's like this image. Oh, well, so it's like, what are you saying? Like men are in a patriarchy, like men are like gods? It's like, no, men are very much castrated here.
Yeah.
And the pact has to be founded on a notion of a God sanction, in the sense that that's the only thing that's going to hold it together.
Right. I like that. No, I like that. And even look at someone like Julius Caesar, who saw himself as a god, but it's like, it wasn't enough. Like, you can even tell that his lack of castration showed, because he even hated the Christians. But what made him hate the early Christians more is that they wouldn't see him as a god. It's like he wanted their demand. And it's like that, and then also having his face on the coins as a god, right? Like, wasn't he supposed to be like the incarnation of like Ares or Jupiter or some shit, or Mars?
It descended from Jupiter, at least. But I mean, in ancient Rome, self-deification,
apotheosis,
apotheosis. It was always very tricky and didn't always command the respect and acknowledgement that people would want it to. But speaking of ancient Rome, I think we can go into Sosie here, and we get to the exchange that I was describing before, where, well, first, actually, I like what he says here about, Chinese theater, and he coins this portmanteau here, miraginary.
Yeah, I really like that.
combines like mirage and imaginary. It's like this is one of the first, Lacanisms, neologisms that
Yeah.
we're getting early into the seminar, which is kind of cool. And he talks about this Chinese theater where the characters, they literally pass through one another, and you would think they're going to bump into each other, but the beauty of it, the skill, their acrobatics are so agile that they literally, like, it seems like they're passing through one another.
Right. And I really like that about it. It's like rather than go to these, schemas and topologies of like a Fairbairn bro, it's like, no, it's like let's do some portmanteaus and talk about miragery of like Chinese theater to get like this illustrative example of how the ego relation functions, right? It's like metaphor is more important for him than just like doing all these models and ending up like a Leclerc, fetishizing the subject, or in this case, confusing the ego for the subject. It's like it's important to see it in these dynamics that this is what the imaginary economy does, right? Passing through one another, right? Almost bumping in, but not, right? Because what's at stake is this imaginary aggressivity. He'll say later that there is a paranoid structure to the obsessional, but just overall the ego. Like the ego has a sort of psychosis to it embedded in, because what it's paranoid about is the other taking itself away from him.
Right. And hence the anxiety,
right,
provoked by the figure of the double, the
right,
rival,
yeah,
someone who seems to resemble a persona too closely and becomes a threat, because it's the narcissism of little differences in many ways that characterizes that breathing room that allows one to not be completely face to face with the double, in the sense that when you meet your other, like Sosie, it becomes also, in this case, linguistically and this is a kind of who's on first shtick routine, but it becomes a question of where am I? And that's, I like what he says about the miragery character of space, and not so, because where and space and these considerations bring into the account the virtual point from which the ego sees itself. So, and that's nowhere. This is the issue. So who goes there? Me, who? Me, courage, Sosie tells himself. What is your fate? Tell me. To be man and speak. Lacan loves this because that is the fate of man, to speak. And speaking makes man what he is. Are you master or servant? Then we get the master-slave dialectic here, depending on how I feel. Because I think the whole idea of the master-slave dialectic place the focus on the master part. Oh, everyone's trying to master everybody else. But no, people are also, we're egoistically submitting themselves to servitude, lowering themselves as well. Like we often, maybe even more so, put ourselves in the place of the slave. But what he talks about here, there's a reversibility to it, because you put yourself in the place of the slave to hopefully master the other's desire. And the one that does that the most, the best, or the case par excellence, is the obsessional. Who wants to master the desire of the other, even though outwardly they are the most slavish.
Exactly. Yeah. Like the reality is like, they're the most slavish. They're obsessing, they're undermining themselves. they question whether or not they're alive. Are they actually living, or are they dead? But internally, they have these fixation fantasies of this big other who they're trying to understand the rules and coordinates of desire, right? And even though there's this distinction between the hysteric and the obsessional, but like ultimately, even the obsessional has a sort of hystericization to them with Kevoy. It's like, what do you want from me? Like, so that they could master the other's desire and know what it's like to enjoy. It's kind of it always reminds me of the Signorelli motif of Freud when like he forgets Signorelli's name in the painting. Somehow he's thinking of like, was it Botticelli and some other name, but somehow and somehow like it ends up tracing back to life or death, sexuality and death, because of a patient who said like a life without sex would be not worth living, pretty much. And like, because he was this like nympho, and at the same time, like it wasn't good enough. Like he's demanding the other, like this obsessional is demanding like, what does the other want? Like, how do I enjoy without like living a life that isn't worth living?
But let's save that. That's very good. Let's save that for when we talk about the end. I think that's when it'll really come in, when we talk about the obsessional. Also, is the word slavish or Slavish? Did I combine Slavic and slave, or I don't know?
Yeah, that's good.
Be appropriate because the work we deal with involves a lot of Slavic thinkers. The Slavs, although I do think they come from the same root.
Right, I think they
But yeah, so he encounters himself. It becomes a kind of who's on first routine, and the response when Amphitryon encounters him is, well, he gets frustrated.
Mm-hmm.
He finds him annoying, but he thrashes him, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Amphitryon rains blows on poor Sosie after Sosie says, well, like I met me.
Mm-hmm.
Amphitryon doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. I got no fight with me, the me who kicked me out, as Lacan says. And then Amphitryon gets frustrated with him and beats him up. And I like what Lacan says here. He analyzes his negative transference for him. I thought you would do a better job of explaining why this is. He must reintegrate into his ego properties.
Right. And so like, from my understanding, like, I don't think Lacan or Lacanians would ever use negative transference or like positive transference.
Being sarcastic.
Yeah, like I think he's just being sarcastic. But for like what that means pretty much is just like when you have a negative transference, and like this is something that like most of like the Freudian revisionists, relational and object relationists will use. Negative transference just means it's like the patient meets the analyst with strong ambivalence or hate, and yet they still like are invested in the analytic session. They're just expressing all their hate that's on the unconscious towards the analyst. So it's like, and at the same time, the analyst, and I'm not sure if there is a countertransference on the level of the analyst to help reintegrate those properties, as he's saying, but that's like pretty much what's happened. It's just like, so like, Amphitryon rains blows on poor Sosie. It's like, so he's expressing his hate, and yet like he's got to integrate that imaginary aspect back into him to kind of construct a more solidified identity,
But it seems like when he says reintegrate into his ego properties, that doesn't sound like something Lacan would advocate.
No,
he's like echoing Fairbairn there, right?
Yeah, I think he's just being sarcastic.
Which is kind of, it's interesting though, the way he portrays the analyst there, in that the object relationist would be someone to thrash the analyst, and
Mhm.
when you think, oh no, but the analyst is trying to help you out, but
Right.
there's an aggressivity to it in that it's like, no, reintegrate these ego properties into your ego,
Right.
be healthy, have a fully reintegrated ego. You must here, and this is what it looks like in Amphitryon. He says later, like, Amphitryon's one of these guys who really believes in the phallus. And
Yeah, and because
right?
what is a remodeling of the ego but the analyst ego, like trying to say this is how you should be.
me.
Yeah, because like even someone like a Winnicott bro like talks about hate in the countertransference. It's like to like receive the hate from the patient. It's like you kind of give it back to them so that like you could show them like the ego, and then like it's a tool of countertransference to like let them relate to that, and then they kind of work through that on an imaginary level. In terms of like Lacanian theory, it's like that's an imaginary sort of economic exchange. It has nothing to do with language or the real, right? So like I think like that's like a good way to put it. It's like they're like Amphitryon's being exactly what like Fairburn like idealizes or fetishizes.
Supportive Amphityon gives him some supportive psychotherapy here.
Yeah, he's like he says that too. He's a psychotherapy.
Yeah, and Amphitryon at his own door, the victim of this spiritual cuckoldry, is the patient, and I guess cuckoldry referring back to play itself. But yeah, what's funny about it is, when does he talk about Amphitryon again? But basically, Lacan likes Sosie more than Amphitryon here, because Sosie really gets to the heart of the Sosie's dilemma in encountering himself has a kind of honesty to it, in the sense that this is the situation.
Right.
The ego is always in. Whereas Amphitryon is like this phallic figure, in that we get the sense that Amphitryon, like I said, believes there is an Amphitryon, whereas Sosie is, as a slave, if you think about it, he's thrown off, but he accepts in some strange way that there is another him. Whereas Amphitryon, remember, Amphitryon doesn't encounter his doppelganger who does exist. He can't believe there's more than one of him. He thinks there's only one.
Yeah.
Right? He thinks he's a unified body.
Right. And that's what makes Amphitryon like an object relations bro. He thinks that like he knows what's best. And if I'm not mistaken, Sosie, what makes Lacan really intrigued by Sosie is like, well, this is how the ego functions in analysis, and what they're not really understanding is that like, okay, like even with this like dynamic, we get like an understanding that the ego in the obsessional, in the neurotic, it's like it just can't seem to get it right, or even listening to the master, you will still get it wrong, like and demand like what, like how do I enjoy, right? Like that's the whole thing about the master slave dialectic, is that like you were saying, like it was earlier that like it's really the work of the slave, and sometimes we put ourselves in servitude in hopes to gain mastery, but if we actually have it, well, who knows if we actually could get it. It's the fantasy of one day achieving mastery, but I think the reality of actually getting that would cause what he would evoke later on in this seminar. Like he calls it imaginary death, but I wonder if he wants to change that to symbolic death, like in seminar 7. But like this risk of losing that position of that stability by encountering this imaginary death, by achieving mastery, may also mean encountering imaginary death.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about that is it has a lot to do with not the kind of emancipatory politics that we're interested in, but let's say like more fake liberal emancipatory radlib kind of emancipatory politics, and that one of these pearls of wisdom that you come across, or a general philosophical attitude that a lot of like rad libs would take up, is just like, oh, if only the masses knew how powerful they were, the ones in subjugation, if they only knew how powerful they were, like came to this kind of, and it's a caricature of class consciousness if you think about it. If they came to this kind of awareness, then they would rise up and overthrow their masters, but everyone's so conditioned to believe
Right.
that they are ontologically slaves. But it's like, well, there might be some truth to that, but it's not just this question of programming and conditioning. It's also, like you just said, to overthrow the master, and this does happen from time to time, to take the position of the master. And it's like, you think the slave hasn't throughout history dreamed of being the master, talked shit on the master, said like, what makes the fuck the master? What makes him the master? He's not like, this idea that there's a complete and full investment, brainwashed kind of investment into the master is itself a myth. It's that if I was ever to attain the place of the master, then that would result in a kind of imaginary death.
Right. And you see the disavow of ones like, right, like, today, like, this whole thing about, oh, tax the rich, or like, I hate the rich, I'm an anti-capitalist. It's like, no, you're not, because like, if these people that you hate, these billionaire classes, if they were like women, queer, non-binary, you'd be totally fine with that. But the point that I'm making is just like, there's just so much resentment of saying like, oh, they have all this power and they're just like, hoarding in their wealth. And meanwhile, people can't live a decent life because they don't have livable wages, like, these Jeff Bezos, these Elon Musks, these Mark Zuckerbergs. But it's like, even them, like, they disavow and believe that they're on the level of the slave and want to say that there's this big other, they like people like Elon Musk with this whole AI and trying to go to Mars and stuff like that. Like there's all these like paranoid fantasies in them too that try to make them like mystify their position or disavow it by trying to be a slave. I mean, like, it's making me think of like recently Mark Zuckerberg himself has been posting up footage of him competing in jiu-jitsu as a white belt. He's a white belt, and he's like, that's like an example of showing it's like, I'm not this like person of high status that owns literally the monopoly of social media with the metaverse. I'm this like average ordinary person like everybody else. I'm trying to embrace the struggle of working hard and starting from ground zero as a white belt, and like one day I'll achieve that black belt. I mean, he's sure he's working hard, doing jiu-jitsu and stuff, and even like he's got some MMA coaches, but it's just like, that's the level of disavow. It's just like, no, I'm an ordinary person,
right? Yeah, I saw a good meme too that was like, why does everybody who says eat the rich live in a house like this? It's just like a big house in a cul-de-sac. It's always upper middle class people who are just imagining it's them and the super rich, or it's the super rich or the super poor.
Right.
But what's great is for them, they can obfuscate their location on that spectrum, and it's the super rich are the problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the super rich, which is basically a cabal, but it's a cabal that's out in the open. These are the same people who think, oh, well, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you're an idiot because you think that there's a secret cabal, and they'll be like, no, it's right out there in the open. And it's like, well, no, yeah, the conspiracy theorist is also an idiot, but like, you're an idiot if you think it's just, oh, well, yes, of course, this is like a group of highly wealthy people that make a lot of the decisions, but in the series Succession, when the one character, Kendall, decides to go after his father, he starts spouting all of these woke bromides. And at one point he's like, fuck the patriarchy. And it's like, who could he be talking about? He's supposed to be this mega billionaire.
Yeah.
The richest people on the planet. So if one of the richest people on the planet can say that, like, who are they referring to? I think we
Right.
were off on a tangent here, but it's kind of
Well,
relevant to this master
it's a
slave thing.
it's a good tangent because it just shows like, well, what who is really the master then in this like master slave dialectic? What Lacan is trying to do with this Kojevian model is show the imaginary tension, the libidinal economy of jouissance. And so far as like, let's take like the wonderful Isabel Millar talking about, the six and even seven paradigms of jouissance in her book Psychoanalysis of AI. That the first paradigm, and then someone like Chiesa is talking about this in Subjectivity and Otherness, that the imaginary jouissance in early Lacan is very much like it's echoed only a little bit, but in the theory, it is orchestrated around this imaginary economy of this other that helps me formulate my ego, is taking away something that I want. This master is, taking away my enjoyment. But what is this enjoyment? It's the recognition, right, by the master, and I will fight hard to get it. So that's where the tension is. And so playing the role of the slave and one day mastering the master's enjoyment is part of this. Like, this will make me an ideal ego, right? Because that's what's happening. And trying hard to even model this ego ideal, right?
Well, what's cool about this is Seminar 1, I feel like it laid the groundwork for the introduction of the symbolic order, and he talked a lot about the Kojevian master-slave dialectic, but now we have the other, capital O, the big other, and understanding how, and he was very careful and painstakingly describing the entire process by which the big other comes into play is formed virtually.
Exactly.
That it, much like maybe we could even say counterpart to the virtual point from which the ego sees itself.
Right.
We refer back to the optical schema again and again. The big other forms from that. Check out our other episodes.
Right.
With the optical schema. Read the logical time essay.
The beginning of For They Know Not What to Do on the one literally talks about the virtual point in which the ego can see or brings about the virtual big other, because there is this this tension of the symbolic and the imaginary is not like this like two extremes on like some Manichaeanism level. It's like, no, the imaginary actually produces the symbolic from this double reflection. There's this virtual hooking point in which it manifests the symbolic, but that virtual hooking point is not the build this instantiated like archetypal image, the ideal ego. No, it's the ego ideal, which helps quilt the master signifier, or the big other, which is the effective language, right? And in that virtual point is the ego ideal. That keeps the slave going to one day achieve the master's desire, is the ego ideal. And what continuously pursues that, even if it fails, is the superego, right? Because the superego relies on that. Yeah, the superego relies on that demand via insistence, and insistence which is an ignorance, as we talked about on Questions for the Teacher. But like the superego is like always get it right, as Mikey says, get it right.
Yeah, and that kind of corresponds to the subject capital S that the ego refers himself to, addresses with these constant importunate demands. They're addressed to an absolute subject, a subject beyond whoever we're talking to in the moment, whoever we're interacting with. And this can be understood like in the context of when an ambassador from another country speaks for that country, UN ambassador, when that ambassador is addressed by another ambassador, politician, whomever, who's being addressed? That person, the guy who put his socks on that morning, who got a drink from the mini bar? Like, no, the country that he represents.
Yeah.
So that's just things. In this case, he becomes the mouthpiece for a kind of a big other. That's all to say. And you can see this, and we all know people like this in our lives, and we're all like this. People who, and especially, I mean, in Twitter, for example, exemplifies this. When you look at a tweet, I don't know, something that's very specific or reads like something that hasn't been crafted for a general audience, but is directed at someone in particular, there's a subreddit for it where it's kind of like oddly specific. You're like, who is this addressed to? And the psychoanalysis is a practice, is a praxis, wherein it's like that comes back at you. Who is this addressed to? Who are you addressing? Now, an object relationist is going to say, well, you're talking to your dad, you're talking to your mom. That's who that's the figure behind the scenes. That's Oz behind the curtain.
Right.
Is your mom or dad? Big reveal. But that now people don't tend to not buy into that because it's like that's such a kind of cliche in our culture that is my psychotherapist going to be like, oh, it's all about my mom, it's all about my dad? No, there's more to it.
Yeah.
Than just that.
There's a virtuality, and like really it's like it's the again, like I said on our other episode the other day, like the voice and nothing more. It's like there's a voice that continues to permeate that is the virtual big other. And of course everybody tries to be the mouthpiece for it, and there's the failure because there is that gap between the imaginary body, the mother or the father, and the symbolic role that they try to play that fail and sometimes get undermined.
Sure.
I always like to use the term because of like, my Marxist background, Althusserian background, interpolation. But as Zizek says, interpolation always fails. Dollar says the same thing. So like there's failed interpolation. So the inability to fully be subjectivized in that role, but yet there is that exponential excess of the voice that still kind of like lingers on, right? That still haunts.
Yes. Yeah. That excess, to me, it becomes the echo of the superego injunction.
Yeah. To enjoy, not to say, oh, you shall not, because that's another thing that it's cliche about a psychotherapist or object relationist, bro, is that they think that the superego is like this persecutory, juridical, like you shall not do this. It's like, no, the superego wants you to do, it wants you to enjoy. And it's cool because you can't meet the high standard of what it means to enjoy, what it means to be more, be alive.
So, okay. And at this juncture, you could listen to what we're saying and try to reduce it to just being content with yourself as you are enough. No, that's not it either. It's not like, hey, shut that voice off. I even saw like in the classroom today, it was like list of like 2 columns. One was just like, I'm not good enough. I am good enough. Or like, I'm not smart. This is too hard. I'm going to keep trying. Like these sort of, you should think more like this than this. Think positively rather than negatively. Shut that voice down in your head. We're not, like, the whole point is that, one, as you just said, it's not telling you you're not good enough because you're not skilled enough or because you have this poor self-image that was just inculcated in you. It's telling you to enjoy and not compromise on your desire. But 2, when it's not your desire, right? It's the desire of the other. And what that means is that the other must be rectified, reconstituted, patched up all the time for us to believe that it exists to truly invest and not lose the cohesion that we have. And this is where it goes back to the slave thing. the obsessional has to, at any cost, even if it means maybe like literally cutting off a limb or something, make sure that it is abiding by its own imaginary set of rules that apply to the other's desire in order for the other to be whole and real and self-consistent. Even if he says, I hate the other, the other's the worst, I hate the government, I hate conservatives, I hate liberals, I hate, either way, if you hate Antifa, you imagine that Antifa has this, remember, and this is where the quilting point comes in, right? Now I'm jumping all over the place, but I like this train of thought. It's kind of like, here's where Antifa comes in, where it's kind of like, well, Antifa on the one hand, these people, they're all idiots. They are all, they all got participation trophies growing up and don't know what it's like to actually work a job, and they're all privileged, but at the same time, it's like all of these different contradictions would be condensed in there, but they're also like from the streets. They're also crude, right? They're overeducated. But they don't know they don't know much at all, but they're highly organized, but they can't work a AK-47. You know, it's like there are all these different contradictions, which are all condensed in this one image. But what's the point? Why? Because your or build, as you said, the cohesion of your own image depends on something being self-consistent. And it's even better if it's something you hate.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Especially nowadays, because we live in a civilization of hatred.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's the whole point that, like, you know, Freud was getting at with civilization discontent, is that there is this like level of hatred that still maintains the order. And, you know, there is a cohesion, but it's just like at the same time, like, it makes functioning possible. Of course, he was an apolitical person, but there is still an extent to Freud's theory in which it's kind of incomplete to say that, oh, he's just a bourgeois thinker. No, I mean, someone like Rosichner realized that, you know, Freud was critiquing the limits of bourgeois individuality. You know, shout out to Daniel Tutt, who made a conversation about that. But like, we could see how like Zizek is able to, you know, use this for understanding ideology. And Lacan right here is showing that, like, yeah, there is this like enjoyment in the other, even through hatred. And you know, the jouissance that comes with that, it's like, that's where the ideology of scapegoating comes in, right? You know, a society that's binded together by excluding an other that's responsible for one's misery.
Yes. And it's not just the scapegoating that liberals accuse the conservative racist doing, which is the more obvious example. It's done across the board.
Because they, that's exactly, because like the reality is, like, you know, your conservative bro, like your Tucker Carlson, like, as much as they like are publicly like being like, oh, the liberals want to take away my you know, sexualized green M&M. It's like, well, they're not trying to, like, he's not, him and like, you know, all these conservatives are not trying to like scapegoat in the sense like they're the reason why, you know, America's falling, or like Western values are falling to an extent, yes, but it's like not so much that what they're doing is creating like a totalitarian fascist state, because scapegoating ideology is, you know, a part of fascism. Like, because the reality is that like a conservative bro would just be like, you know, I don't care what you believe, I don't care what you're into, just leave me alone. I just want to be invested in my own, you know, enjoyment, like enjoying my property, etc. That's really what a conservative wants. It's like only when they feel like something's being taken away to an extent, like they hystericize or feel paranoid, but they don't want to like destroy the other or create factions. It's only in the fact that it creates an ideology in which the other is the reason why society is failing, and that we need to militarize on that, is when
some would claim they do want to destroy the other, but the rhetoric today It's exactly that.
I
It's
mean,
about
with
self-preservation, right?
Todd McGowan, like, he would say that it's like, no, like the conservative depends upon like that, like phantasmatic liberal that wants to take away the sexualized green M&M or the vein on the Snickers.
The dick vein on the Snickers.
Yeah.
All right. Do we want to talk about this little vagina?
Yeah, because
Let's talk about this very tiny vagina. This episode is gonna get us canceled between talking about how like that. The one line could be right out of Andrew Tate, where he's like, "Society is androcentric, centric."
Right.
That's a fact. Fake, like half British, half American.
Well, there's a funny meme going on. Like, I don't know who posted it. It was like definitely one of these like Deluzos that was like saying like how Andrew Tate is like on the side of the LGBTQ plus community, saying like, "Oh, would you prefer Hulk Hogan with a vagina or Megan Fox with a penis?" And he's pretty much dismantling like gender norms without realizing it.
Hilarious.
Yeah.
This very tiny vagina. She has a very tiny vagina. Only top G's like tiny vaginas.
This little box.
Oh my god. Pseudo hermaphroditism. So we're back to Fairbairn. He really doesn't like Fairbairn. I feel like he's trashed some other analysts so far, but like not like Fairbairn. He's like, I'm gonna ruin this whole man's career, basically.
Yeah. He's literally like on some like Soldier Boy stuff. He's like, he took my whole flow, my whole style.
Yeah.
So yeah, now we like
obsessional. I like this part, but like he's really spitting here.
Yeah.
Wait, I got confused because sometimes like he just describes like the most simple things in the most
in the weird
way where I'm like, wait, what? Like so her vagina is too small for her to have sex, basically, but like a lot of guys are into her, or
I'm guessing so. Like this is like yeah, but like what I think he's getting at is just like this fact that like, because what he's getting at is like this person who's in the hysterics clinical structure, correct?
No, she's obsessional, right?
She's an obsessional.
No, he says it's not an obsessional case.
Yeah,
but she has a genital abnormality. She's a virgin. She becomes a teacher. This way, I'll miss out on a lot of worries. So I guess her sexuality is sublimated elsewhere or something.
Right.
He's not so interested in her as a case. It's like Lacan barely talks about any case studies of his own.
Right. Yeah.
He just talks about how other people get their case studies wrong.
Right.
But or like he seems so bored by most people's actual life circumstances in a lot of ways. I'm sure he was his technique was highly effective, but he doesn't talk about his own cases very often.
Right. He really doesn't. No, like
at least not in these seminars, maybe later.
I don't know. He just really talks about a lot of just, theory and like these like thought and motion dialogues, which is really interesting because it's the same thing that we talk about. Like if like he's hardly defining clinical structures, really. He doesn't really make space for an emphasis on like what a clinical structure is. You just kind of like will nonchalantly throw out like a descriptive of like obsessionality, of hysteria, psychosis. Obviously the psychosis seminar is a clinical structure based seminar, but like to the extent like he's not really defining like how you treat it. This is an example of a case, like, that's what just makes him very interesting. And like when he does talk about a case, it's like somebody else's case. It's just like, oh yeah, this is where you got it wrong. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, and it may be that the fact it's like, well, because like all these other analytic discourses want to situate themselves away from Freud, want to see themselves as a positive science, but they never really create a discourse of what analysis is, but try to ground themselves in psychology. And then they run into a lot of blind alleys and errors. And so, like, I think what Lacan is doing is he's pretty much in the business of like negation, like, you know, working through the immanent critique, you know, via negativity. I mean, like someone like Freud, who published his cases, but he published his failed cases. Isn't that
Right,
so?
right.
Like, you know, he's not only analyzing the famous cases of like the Rat Man, the Wolf Man, Dora, you know, but like he's looking at like interesting cases in other analysts, and it's just like, well, like here's what they should have done. Like, let us reflect back to Dora. Let us reflect back to the Wolf.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, exactly. That's how much faith they both must have in psychoanalysis.
Mhm.
Because it's just like why directors don't tend to depict happy couples in movies.
Right, exactly.
boring.
You know, isn't that why like the couple that finally comes together, it's always at the end.
It's always at the end, because then it's
Yeah.
like what is there to talk about?
Yeah.
So yeah, proximity of a certain man has an effect on her, but she's horribly tyrannized by her scruples. Essentially, she feels guilt. The issue is that I think Fairbairn wants to get at the core of her symptom via
Right.
guilt. He's looking
Right.
for guilt.
And so he evokes regression, right? Something of regression, and he like talks about the depressive qualities of these images of men, linked to the fact that man, what do you say? Linked to the fact that man, that's her, right? And so pretty much, I mean, for Fairbairn, he's an object relationist, and regression is a big concept that I think it's like, oh, if there's anything that you're experiencing right now, it's like these repetition of certain symptoms. It's not like, oh, repetition compulsion of death drive. Oh, it's like you're regressing back to your primitive object relation, which is the evocation of the bad object, the cruel super ego mother that wants to make you feel bad. And so that's what you're feeling. You're feeling the super ego, which is the mother saying that this is a bad object. No, bro. Like we're not on the level of imaginary mother and an object. You know, we're even going beyond intersubjectivity. We're talking about language, and we're talking about, you know, death drive and insistence. The super ego is not the mother. The super ego is just a virtual voice, right? That has a relation to the symbolic and the real, right? And that tells you to enjoy. It's like you could feel guilty, you could feel persecuted, but it's not because you're doing something wrong in the sense that you did something like illegal or you feel like you need to be punished. It's like, oh, and the fact that you don't know what it's like to enjoy, like you're trying to enjoy, but there is this like confusion of what it means to follow the injunction to enjoy on a level of neurosis, right? And even hysteria. The pervert doesn't feel guilt, right?
Right. Because she's biologically indeterminately gendered here. So he talks about penis nade, which is penis envy.
Mm-hmm.
And
right. Which is a Freudian term.
So he's like, here he says it's not the penis. The author tells us, oh, it would be entirely incorrect to think that the penis nade is entirely natural in women. Who told him it was natural? Of course, it's symbolic. That's the whole point. They have no concept.
Mm-hmm.
These psychoanalysts or these psychotherapists have no concept of the symbolic. So this symbolic order has an androcentric perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about the phallus,
right?
Not the penis.
Not the penis, yeah. And you know, for Freud, he did confuse the phallus for the penis, but Lacan seems like, no, the phallus, because I mean, I think it was you that was saying that, like, for the phallus in the symbolic order, the phallus is the signifier that signifies all signifieds, right? Or the phallus is a signifier for all signifieds.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like if the phallus is that signifier that's trying to get enjoyment from encompassing what a signified is for the most part. Yeah.
Exactly. But also, to quote Derek Cook, also the index of impossibility.
Right.
However, well, one enjoying or getting to the end of signification.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one jouissance is only in language in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's only in jouissance.
Yes.
In the enjoyment of meaning. If you really think about it, I don't know if he would say that at this point, but it's like, okay, we have these psychologisms here that have to do with a naturalization of saying, oh, but all of these theorists, all of these psychotherapists, they think that they're also crucially undermining Freud at different points in ways that are very dynamic and push the needle forward.
Yeah.
Or psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, when he's like, to say, oh, well, you know, penis envy isn't entirely natural, it isn't to say much at all.
Yeah, you know,
have to reconfigure the playing field to begin with.
It's like saying the same thing about, oh, libido is just not objective. And then you mentioned like its relation to love. Let's just like talk about how we need to talk about an object instead. It's just like, well, you're not really reading the thread of thought in Freud. You're just like, I can't understand it. You know, it's like the meme, the SpongeBob meme of Patrick trying to hammer something, but like the fucking the 2x4 and the nail are in his head, and he's just like hammering the table like that. Yeah. These are like these object relationists.
That's a meme. You should make that one.
Yeah. I probably get so much hate for it. But it's like, that's exactly because they're not reading Freud like correctly. They're just like, oh, these are supposed to be the scientific things in Freud, but it's like, Freud isn't scientific enough. Let me tell you why, you know, I'm going to go beyond Freud. And they fall into errors that Freud already went past off. Like, he's just in these deadlocks of like, you know, theoretical frameworks. So it's like, how does Death Drive really fit in without undermining my entire, like, you know, train of thought that I've come to this far, you know?
Should we try to wrap it up? And the way I want to do it is to bring us back to the beginning, because I don't know if we do this enough, but this lecture was about what, essentially? Remember in the beginning, he says, it's the beginning of this one where he's like, last year we talked about the ego in relation to the transference.
Yes.
This year we're talking about the ego in relation to the symbolic order.
Yes.
So we have to remember that this was a strange kind of bricolage of different elements that we have in this lecture. But what really ties all this together is, and this entire seminar, really, it's about the symbolic order. Mm-hmm. Not yet the real. He doesn't have the best idea of what the real is. His notion of the insistence of the symbolic, something he's going to evolve, but maybe we could also say abandon in some way later on, because he's going to have a different notion of the unconscious and the real, and where drives are located, in a sense,
right?
How Death Drive works. Right. But I just want to say that it's like all of this ultimately has to do with the symbolic, and you know, the symbolic is tricky. The analogy that came to mind for me was sort of, you know, when little kids, everyone's done this as a little kid, when you're walking down the sidewalk and you don't want to step on the lines.
Yeah, the cracks, because you'll break your mama's back.
Or it's like, oh, it's lava. Right?
Yeah, that's I used to do that in the grocery store. You know,
everyone does. It's kind of how the symbolic order works, in that we have this network of possibilities and impossibilities.
Yeah.
Oh, you can step on a crack. I've done it. My mother is not yet. Her back she's hurt her back before, but not. I don't think it was because of me. I don't think it was
Yeah.
because of how I walked
Yeah.
down the sidewalk. I
Yeah.
don't think.
Well, that we could see that as like being retrocausal. It's like, oh, your mom broke her back in the past, so
like
it's like
that,
that's why you
yeah.
don't step on the crack, you know, or like it could happen in the near future, or just like you want to step on like the colored tile or like the white tiles in you know, a
Yeah.
Vons or like, you know, a grocery store.
Now you're thinking like an analyst,
Yeah.
but essentially it's like the symbolic order kind of works that way.
Right.
These are arbitrary rules in many cases
Right.
that we're adhering to, but they have there
Well,
is
the thing is-
internal logic.
Yes, because what his symbolic order, if you notice, he's not talking about signifiers or signifieds in the structural linguistic sense yet. Like he hardly uses the term signifiers in here in the first two seminars. But you know, he's talked about the symbolic order with Levi-Strauss, the prohibitions of incest, but then also game theory, you know, when he's talking about odds and evens. So it's like this internal logic within certain games, certain rules that have to be established for something to function like a machine.
Right. And then these rules that proliferate and give birth to certain patterns and an internal logic, and also an internal kind of recording system, an internal memory.
Exactly.
Language has an internal memory to it. That's the nature of the symbolic. It is active. It's very much alive.
Right.
It doesn't matter if it's right or wrong, true or false, smart or dumb.
Mm-hmm.
None of that factors into it. The symbolic order, and it can be changed. That's Zizek's whole thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, is that what the event is, or the radical contingency?
Exactly.
Is the idea that yes, the symbolic order can be changed, but not easily, and definitely not just because someone calls it out.
Right. Exactly.
Calling out isn't going to do it. All right, and with that, we're going to wrap the episode up.
Yep.
Love you all dearly.
May God rest your soul, as the idiot boy says.
Pez out.